Hello and welcome to the Antitrust Code podcast by Concurrences. I'm Jennifer Baker, and today I will be talking to Gregor Langus, who is the director of ECA in Brussels. We're going to be discussing the topic of can data accumulation lead to monopolization? Greg, thank you very much for being with us. Um,
Pleasure.
let's first start by getting into the overall question about all companies collect data nowadays, don't they? So, at what point does it become a problem or problematic to some people?
Yeah. So indeed, all companies collect data, and data is an important source of innovation, competitive advantage, and promotes effective competition, delivers some value. But of course, it can also be a competition issue or a problem more generally. I think that when it comes to competition policy issues, collection of data in itself is never or very rarely an issue. Of course, that does not mean that data is not important in competition policy assessment, in assessment of abuse of dominance, or in mergers, in assessment of mergers. It is very important there, but it plays an indirect role, I think, in terms of sort of the risk that data would enhance market power, create barriers to entry, or lead to market tipping and so on. And of course, competition agencies are very well aware that firms with market power can exploit it, and that's why they will be looking at data and the role of data in how they can create this market power. Yeah, go ahead.
So let me ask you, you were talking about data and the sort of potential it might have in affecting competition. But what sort of data are we talking about? There's lots of different data out there. Some of it's personal information of customers. Some of it might be trade secrets. How do we deal with all these different sorts of data, and which ones are the most interesting to look at?
Yes, for competition policy, I think paradoxically, the data that is capable of providing most value to users is also potentially the most problematic, because it's also capable at the same time of creating some barriers to entry, or leading to risk that markets would tip. And the type of data that does that is the data that sets in motion some reinforcing feedback learning effects. These learning effects then allow the firm to significantly improve the product. And if the product can be improved across all users, then you can have a kind of like a reinforcing loop that is set in motion. Very often that will be the data that platforms collect from end users, not always. Internet search may be a good example here. But data that Facebook or Google collects on users, Google in the case of YouTube, does not seem to be as powerful in this regard, because they do not extend, the learning effects do not extend so well across many users. So whereas these firms are probably protected to some extent by the traditional network effects, they are, in my view, not as well protected by these uh, you know, um, data-enabled learning effects, which kind of set in motion this feedback loop. So there are different types of data, obviously, and to you would have to look at the details to see whether data is a problem, and it can lead to market tipping in itself.
Well, you mentioned these big tech giants, and that's sort of who we're looking at or thinking about today. Because of, I guess, they collect the most data. That's why they're in ways so big and so dominant. But how important is the market sector and defining the market sector when considering data as a competition asset?
Well, yeah, so perhaps we could like rephrase that a little bit. I mean, data that you collect in one segment, or in provision of a certain service, can sometimes be extended and used to provide other services. And of course, that has both, pro-competitive and anti-competitive potential. Pro-competitive in that it allows multi-market platforms to compete effectively with other multi-market platforms, but it can be anti-competitive because it can also allow to kind of like stifle a nascent entrant, an aspiring entrant. I think maybe it's this what you're getting at, something like that.
Okay, well, let's move on to the question then of data minimization. If we're talking about data accumulation, then I guess the flip side has to be data minimization. And this is something that is enshrined in principle in the General Data Protection Regulation. But that's a privacy law rather than a competition law. So I'm wondering, could such a principle even be concluded within antitrust or competition law?
Well, I mean, I think that would be counterproductive for several reasons. One reason is that you can use the data that you collected in one market to enter another market and provide valuable services in that market. In that sense, data collection that can be then extended to other markets can be pro-competitive because it allows, multi-market firms to kind of aggregate this data and then use it, deploy it in order to compete with other multi-market platforms in other markets. So I think in that regard, it would be counterproductive. Example would be Microsoft, Amazon, Google, Facebook, Apple, which are dominant perhaps in different markets to some extent, but they use data that they collect in this market and they aggregate to then compete across these variables markets and entering each other's turfs. So in that sense, I think data minimization would be counterproductive. But of course, if you minimize data collection, data aggregation across various services, then you perhaps allow smaller rivals which are maybe less efficient to actually enter, build data advantage and then ultimately challenge a dominant platform somewhere. I think there is a trade-off there.
Yeah, I mean, let's not say less efficient. I mean, they may just be startups. They may not have been around as long. They may be new market entrants with their own very innovative ideas, but it does take time to scale up, and they may not have the backing of some of them. I mean, you'd mentioned these big tech giants competing against each other, but if you're a small startup in a field with a great idea and they've just squashed you, that's probably not what you're going to think.
Well, yes, I agree. However, we are operating in markets where there are, sometimes pronounced network effects and some efficiencies which come with data accumulation. We've discussed that. And, it's precisely these efficiencies and that actually generate some value. And, I think that more often than not, the most effective competitors will actually be large multi-market platforms competing with other large multi-market platforms, because they will be able to utilize all these efficiencies that come from data accumulation, data aggregation, to actually enter each other's turfs and compete with another. But Jennifer, I wanted to mention the other reason why I think this principle of data minimization would be a bad idea, and that is because data feeds innovation, and innovation is uncertain. And the more data you can collect in terms of breadth and depth, the more likely you will be able to then find some ways in which data can help you improve your products. Just take an example search. These results can be greatly improved if you also collect location data, weather data, interests, and so on. And this can be extended, I think, to many products. In fact, what platforms do well, especially successful platforms, that's why they're successful, is actually combine this data in order to generate value, which then attracts users, which then generate data, and so on. And you have this positive reinforcement feedback loop, which sets in motion and releases some value ultimately.
Well, I hear what you say from a point of view of building up a business. But there are people who are very concerned about this. For example, in the European Parliament, there have been resolutions voted on and approved by MEPs to say we should break up Google. It always seems to be Google, but it is these large big tech platforms that there are concerns that they are too big to regulate, and that includes competition. So, I mean, what are the considerations here when we're talking about these sort of tech monopolies? What would you say to those people to ease their fears who do think they've gotten out of control?
Yeah, well, I think here the concern again is not really the data accumulation aggregation per se as it is. It perhaps it plays a role, but more um, um, as a factor that mediates the creation of market power, or that helps entrench some large platforms. The concerns, I think, are more related to how then, to the types of conduct, different types of conduct that are not directly related to data accumulation, that firms with market power may then engage in, like exclusivity arrangements. We've seen this with European Commission's cases in Google, tying different products in a way which excludes competition, self-preferencing. We've seen that again in Google cases. We see that in these concerns that have been now raised, and well, actually lawsuits that have been brought in US against Google, against we will probably soon see something coming against Amazon, Facebook, etc. So it's really not the data accumulation itself, but the conduct, other types of conduct that these firms are engaged in. And in terms of what we can do about it, well, we need to enforce antitrust laws vigorously, maybe faster. Maybe we need to set up some groups, expert groups in competition agencies, and that's been going on. The CMA has such a group. I think European Commission will also set something up in that sense, and just enforce and be vigilant.
Well, you mentioned the time. Of course, we have seen some of the cases at EU level with regard to big tech drag on for a decade or more in some cases. So I'm going to ask you to look into your crystal ball and give me your predictions for the sector. We hear some people calling, as I said, for the breakup of big tech. You say we need maybe better, more robust, more timely, speedy enforcement of law. But what do you think will happen over the next 10 to 20 years?
Well, yeah. So one thing is that antitrust enforcement will become more vigorous, faster. Different antitrust authorities will find creative ways to actually enforce faster. They will build expertise. They have already built significant expertise in that. So I think that's one thing. We've seen that there are some, regulations being discussed. I think some of that will probably go through. I don't know exactly in which form and in which ways, but I do think that a lot of folks in the competition sort of circles are aware that one needs to be careful with enforcing some blanket rules, because they can stifle these many efficiencies that data accumulation can create, but also bundling and tying of products, which we know from economics, from many years of research in economics, can release efficiencies. So we'll see that. Then there is this interesting question of what to do about privacy, which kind of like maybe is a little bit orthogonal here. I think that we will get a little bit more tolerance towards these intrusions over time, towards these intrusions of privacy, because privacy is not free lunch. If we insist on a lot of privacy, we may also give up some economic efficiencies. So yeah.
Okay, then a final word. What do you want to leave us with your thoughts? I mean, what steps around data accumulation do you think would reassure people who are worried about it at the moment? Or what steps would you like lawmakers to take or enforcers to take? Just in general, what would be your hopes? So I've heard your predictions. What are your hopes?
Yeah, I think that data accumulation should not become a an important competition policy concerns. I think we should deal with that with consumer protection laws, with more transparency about how data is collected and how it is used. Privacy laws also, but again, we have to be careful how we enforce that in order not to sort of, have some unintended effects. As we know, some people have been complaining about GDPR having some unintended effects in terms of stifling competition, mostly from smaller firms, thus reinforcing the market power of some of the large platforms. Maybe a code of conduct, and as I said, in terms of competition enforcement, we need to continue to build expertise, set up dedicated competition enforcement task groups, and enforce faster.
Okay, Gregor, thank you very much for your thoughts and insight. And thank you to our audience for joining us today for the Concurrences Antitrust Code, which is supported by Facebook. Join me again for another episode soon.
Thank you, Jennifer.